For the last time I'm in a room with the three of you and you have to listen to me, I figured I would try to make it the most important things I've said to you all year. So I want to reflect on John chapter 21, 15 through 18, just after the resurrection story. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He says, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you did not want to go." So I want to focus my reflection this evening on Jesus in this exchange. Christians affirm God as all-knowing, and so usually focus on Peter as if the question is, "Do you love me?" is only asked for his sake, because of course Jesus knows the answer. And so I want to affirm in classic Christian fashion that God is all-knowing and that Jesus does know the answer. But I also think that if we think about God's dealings with humanity, Jesus does have his own reasons for asking the question of Peter. So the first humans, Adam and Eve, are made by God in his image to rule his good creation on his behalf and dwell with him. But they instead listen to the serpent and eat of the forbidden fruit rather than partake of the God's tree of life. Ever since human history has been marred by violence, greed, lust, arrogance, and all kinds of pursuits, our own lesser desires, which never satisfy, rather than pursue the goodness of God. Even the best figures of faith, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, who you've all learned about here at BCS, dropped the ball more times than they carried out. David, called a man after God's own heart, was capable of the vilest actions. And Israel, God's own chosen people, were far more faithful in worshiping the gods of the land than the God who led them out of slavery in Egypt. And so here in this story, God is among humanity in the flesh, in Jesus. During his time, he's been misunderstood, asked to stay away from certain towns and cities, and only a few days before this conversation, brutally murdered by the very religious leaders he had entrusted his law and his promises to. And he has quite a history with Peter, too. He's poured 3 years into him, teaching him, showing him signs and miracles, taking him into his confidence, showing him his glory. But Peter regularly puts his foot in his mouth. On one occasion, Jesus ends up responding to him, "Get behind me, Satan." He's nearby during Jesus' darkest night in Gethsemane, sleeping. And as Jesus is falsely accused and put on trial the night before his execution, Peter is just outside, vehemently denying that he has ever met Jesus. God's relationship with Peter and with humanity has been largely one-sided, as God has poured out his love on his creation, but been largely rejected by his people. In loving humanity and entering relationship with us, God has made himself vulnerable to rejection. In the incarnation, God the Son made himself vulnerable to mockery, poverty, suffering, and even a cruel death by crucifixion. One biblical scholar, Ellen Davis, writes in her provocative book, Getting Involved with God, "We are most vulnerable to emotional pain when the well-being and the faithfulness of those we love are at stake. And as we have seen, the Bible shows that the faithfulness of even the best of God's covenant partners is always up for grabs. So it follows that God's vulnerability and love is an essential element of covenant relation with him. In Jesus' relationship with Peter, Jesus has poured out his love, wisdom, patience, trust, and has even suffered death on his behalf. But Peter has merely repaid it with his own arrogance and his denials of Jesus. Jesus surely knows the answer to the question, "Do you love me?" before he asks him. I think there is something in Jesus that wants to ask Peter himself, and hear Peter answer the question with his own mouth. And as you graduate and go out from BCS into the next stage of your life, Jesus poses the very same question as he opens himself up to relationship with each of you. The way he asked Peter gives us clues for what he means when he asks it of us. In the question, Jesus asks, "Do you actually love me?" because I expect you to show it. Each time that Jesus asks Peter, he follows it up with a command: feed my sheep. Answering yes to this question will require Peter to give up a lucrative fishing career in order to proclaim the love of Jesus he has witnessed, to lead a new community baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and to find himself at odds both with the leaders of his own Jewish faith and the rulers of the Roman Empire he lives within. In the end, this will leave Peter old before his time, chained in a Roman prison, sentenced to death by crucifixion, just as Jesus was. Tradition records that Peter said, "I am not worthy to die as my Lord did," and requested to be crucified upside down. In our text, Jesus told Peter that this is how his life would end, in suffering and death. Answering yes to the question, "Do you love me?" demands everything of us. In another passage, Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." He requires that we commit ourselves completely to him, all of us. Jesus, in asking, "Do you love me?" asks us to constantly give up our own desires for comfort and achievement and success. He calls us instead to a life of self-sacrifice, constantly giving of ourselves for the sake of those around us, just as he did. In Matthew 16:24, Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Life with God is not to be taken lightly. When I graduated from Christian school, I did not know how hard it would be to say yes to the question. I'll confess that in my actions, I say no far more often than I would like to admit, because answering no is the easy way. Answering yes demands everything. Yet this question is also an invitation. It is an invitation to follow Jesus, who does not ask of us anything that he himself would not do. He, in his death, made the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf to deal the final blow to sin, evil, and death. He rose again to give us true life, the life with God we were created to have. One prominent theologian in the history of the church, St. Augustine of Hippo, famously wrote, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." The demand to sacrifice our own desires is an invitation to give up the things that do not satisfy in favor of the love of Jesus that we were created to enjoy. Our hope rests on the fact that God has created this good world, and while we have been faithless to him, he has been faithful to us. He became one of us to free us from any lesser desire that might enslave, and to free us to the joy of his love. Our lives are not headed towards chaos and death and uncertainty, but to the hope of resurrection, of being restored, of living eternally in the perfect world that God makes for us, in his loving presence. St. Paul wrote in Romans 6:4, "Therefore we have been buried with Christ by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life." When Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" he invites us into the full life of his love. And so every day of your life, from even the time you were little and from here on out, Jesus will ask, "Do you love me?" You'll have to grapple with that question as he opens himself up to relationship with you. And do not take it lightly. It will demand everything of you, but it will also offer far more than you could ever imagine. So on behalf of those who love you at Bridgeton Christian, our hope and prayer as we send you off from here is that you will answer Jesus' question, "Do you love me?" with a costly and satisfying yes.